here we go with Chapter 3, Session 1B, Shaking the Powers of Heaven. In 2017, there was a popular movement in the church propelled by John Hagee and Mark Biltz regarding the blood moons, they called it. Hagee wrote a bestseller book, The Four Blood Moons, on the subject. And then because of a solar eclipse, and then they said that Revelation 12 sign occurred on September 23rd, 2017, many believers were catalyzed to almost a fever pitch, anticipating end times events. I heard of people not paying their mortgage for September because they thought Jesus was coming back. The blood moon is a phenomena that occurs during a total lunar eclipse, when the sun's rays pass through the greatest amount of Earth's atmosphere and illuminate the moon just before it is blanked out by the Earth's shadow, or umbra, in eclipse. We see the same thing in the evening when the sun or the sky gets red. In the evening, the sun's shining through more air before it reaches us than when it's shining overhead. And the reddish cast is caused by ozone and water vapor in the Earth's atmosphere and other things refracting. Consequently, the light of the sun passing through the Earth's atmosphere casts a reddish glow on the moon before total eclipse, so it's called a blood moon. Now, Joel and Matthew cannot be describing simultaneous solar and lunar eclipses, because that's physically and scientifically impossible, because a solar eclipse occurs when the moon is between the sun and the earth. Okay? And it always occurs at a new moon, just where the moon is that little sliver. A lunar eclipse happens when the moon's on the opposite side of the earth. At that point, the earth comes between the sun and the moon. And a lunar eclipse is always at a full moon. So, since it's not factual, it seems like they occur simultaneously in the scripture there. Since it's not literally factual, it has to be figurative. But before we move into the figurative, we have to understand what's being implied. Okay? So I'm going to talk to you about blood moons. I'm adapting an article from the internet about the blood moons here. There have been many blood moons throughout history, but some astrologists believe that events like this could be divine signs of his intervention in world affairs, especially in the affairs of Israel. There's been a lot of special interest in times when 4 consecutive lunar eclipses in a 2-year period are all total eclipses, and that event is known as a blood moon tetrad. Tetra is 4. There are 8 blood moon tetrads in the 21st century. 2 of them had already occurred. Moreover, some biblical astronomers say that history shows that when the tetrad dates were close to or coincided with the dates of the Jewish feasts, then they said that might be a special sign or warning to Israel. Sometimes very serious things have happened close to these dates. And of course, things associated with the moon have negative consequences many times. In lore, it's a negative thing. But not all blood moon tetrads have been significant for Israel. For instance, in 1927 and 28, when there was a tetrad, nothing of real significance happened in Israel that I could tell. But then none of the blood moons on that date coincided with the Jewish feast. Also, there was a tetrad in David's first and second year of reign, right around 1000 BC. But that's his first and second year of reign, not in Jerusalem, because he wasn't in Jerusalem till the 7th year. So I don't see anything of significance there. As well as Solomon's 14th and 15th year had a blood moon tetrad. But the temple was finished in his 11th year. So again, I don't see any connection. There weren't any matches of things going on during the reign. But those were positive events, and they're saying that these are ominous negative things usually. One would think that there might be ominous celestial events around the time of World War II with what happened to the Jews, but there are no tetrads then. Now, I mean, there might be people who might talk about the conspiracy theory that the thing that happened to the Jews didn't happen the way that history says it did, but I know it did because my father was a photographer. He had his own photo developing darkroom, and one of the soldiers returning from World War II took pictures of the concentration camps and the bodies. I mean, it was awful. They weren't supposed to take those pictures, and the film would have been confiscated if that soldier had developed it the normal way, sending it off, and they would have seen what it was and reported it. So they asked my dad to develop it in his private studio, but my dad made copies. And I was snooping through his darkroom one time, and I found them. Wow. That and Walt Disney's Fantasia Night on Bald Mountain gave me nightmares for weeks. So, but there were no blood moons during that time. Now, occasionally, all 4 blood moons in the tetrad coincide with the start or close of the feast of Passover or Tabernacles. Here are some. And I got these. These are from the NASA Lunar Eclipse website. In 167 and 166 BC, there was a tetrad, December 27th, 168 BC, June 21st, 167 BC, December 16th, 167 BC, and June 11th, 166 BC. Now, those didn't occur at Passover Tabernacles, but in 168, the Second Temple was looted. Judaism was outlawed by Antiochus Epiphanes. Then on December the 6th in 167 BC, the abomination of desolation occurred. Antiochus Epiphanes was as a type of the Antichrist that was prophesied in Daniel, and he ordered in 167 for an altar of Zeus to be built in the temple. That's what started the Maccabean rebellion, and the rebels won independence in 164, and then the temple was rededicated in December 16th of 164 BC. That's where the Feast of Hanukkah comes from. So there was a blood moon tetrad right during that time, and all kinds of crazy stuff happened in Israel. It's interesting. In 1493 and 1494, there was a blood moon tetrad. April 2nd, 1493, there was an eclipse. Then September 25th, 1493, there was one. Then there was March 22nd, 1494, and September 15th, 1494. Here, the blood moons did not align exactly with Passover and Tabernacles, but what happened to the Jews around that time was King Ferdinand ordered that the Jewish quarter in Granada in Spain was destroyed, and also the church called for the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. Consequently, in 1493, some 37,000 Jews had to leave. In 1494 and 1495, the Jews suffered in Poland, Lithuania, and Italy. So that tetrad saw a Europe-wide persecution of the Jews. Another one, this is a biggie, in 1949 and 1950, there was a blood moon tetrad. April the 13th, 1949, October the 7th, 1949, April the 2nd, 1950, and September the 26th, 1950. And there was a near perfect alignment of blood moons and Jewish feast days. What happened to Israel at that time? Well, that was the first Arab-Israeli war, in which the armies of Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded Israel, and Israel fought for their independence and won. There was an armistice signed in 1949. That's the first Arab-Israeli war. Now, of course, Palestine wants them to go back to the green line that was set up that day by that armistice. The Palestinians are demanding for Israel to return to that border. But I'm not going to take sides, because atrocities have been committed by both sides, Israel and Palestine. But our news media has not been reporting the whole story. If you want to see what Israel did, then Google the Deir Yassin massacre, Deir-Yassin, the Deir Yassin massacre. You'll see the other side of the story, as Paul Harvey would say. 1967 and 1968 was another tetrad. April the 24th, 1967. October the 18th, 1967. April the 13th, 1968. October the 16th, 1968. Again, there's a near-perfect correspondence of dates with Passover and Tabernacles. What happened then? That was the 6-day war in Israel that occurred June 5th through the 10th in 1967, when the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, later Iraq, attacked Israel. They wanted to wipe Israel off the face of the map, but instead the Israeli armed forces crushed the enemy and decisively won the 6-day war. And they gained full access to all of Jerusalem at that time. First time in over 2,000 years. A few months later, at an Arab summit, the Arabs formulated the policy that was in effect until almost last year, when most of the Arab states, for the next 2 decades and beyond, had a no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel because of that. Then, in 2014 and 2015, there was a tetrad. That was April the 15th, 2014, October the 8th, 2014, April the 4th, 2015, and September the 28th, 2015. There was a near-perfect correspondence of the dates with feasts, that also during a sabbatical year. But I don't see very much that happened to Israel. That's when the Third Intifada started, but that's about it. Then there's going to be another tetrad in 2032 and 2033. April the 25th, 2032, October the 18th, 2032, April the 14th, 2033, and October the 8th, 2033. So there is a coinciding with Passover and Tabernacles then. So that might be a crucial time for Israel and the world in the future. NASA says that in 2032, there's a remote possibility that the Earth would get hit by an asteroid. The Bible suggests such an impact in Revelation 8:8, talking about a flaming mountain falling down to Earth. So who knows what's going to happen then? But they said in Matthew 24, verse 29 and 30, the sun and the moon will not give their light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Now, no blood moon is mentioned there, but it's still eclipse talk. But that's in the book of Revelation, possibly. There's the sixth seal that's opened near this time. Revelation chapter 6 talks about a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood, and the stars of heaven fell to earth. So that's eclipses and meteor showers. So, of course, it talks about those eclipses as if they might be simultaneous, but that's not possible. The shortest period of time between a lunar and a solar eclipse is 15 days. And there are many instances that a solar and lunar eclipse have been 15 days apart. In fact, it happens about once a year, although those eclipses might not be total, they're usually partial. Rene has some information on that on his website, in fact. There could be other reasons why the sun is darkened and the moon turns to blood, and meteor showers, astronomical things. We don't know what those could be. But at first it may seem that the blood moon dates are significant. I mean, it's tantalizing, but it doesn't hit the bullseye for me, because let's take a step back and consider the facts. I did some research on the NASA website, and lunar eclipses always fall at the time of a full moon. There have been 55 tetrads since the time of Christ. Only 7 tetrads have fallen on Jewish feast days. But now, is that significant? Well, it's actually inevitable, because Jewish feast days are also at the time of a full moon, the same time as there's lunar eclipses. So 7 out of 55 is not by itself remarkable. It might seem that way to those who don't crunch the numbers or know basic astronomy or know about the Jewish calendar, and that's unfortunate, because they could be taken advantage of by people presenting this information. The authors of the Blood Moon Tetrad teaching, John Hagee and Mark Biltz, sensationalized it, saying that they're connected to significant Jewish events. Well, maybe some of them, but not all. In fact, I listened to some of their teachings, and boy, did they whip up the crowd. But some eclipses were not seen in Israel. Now, sure, when the State of Israel was formed in May 1948 and 1949, there was a blood moon tetrad. And the Six-Day War, there was a blood moon tetrad. Abomination of Desolation in 168 BC, it's 167. That was very interesting. But not all blood moon tetrads since the first century have had stuff happen to Israel, like in 162 and 163 AD, 795 and 796 AD, 842 and 843 AD, 860 and 861. They tried to tie events to Israel, but when I looked at them, they seemed rather tenuous to me. So the tetrads may seem significant. But the key question is, have the things that were predicted by the blood moon proponents come to pass? Well, I think it's critical to look at 2014 and 2015, because that's the most recent one that they were building up. And, we talked about it at the Hope Mini Summit in 2017, Renee and Diane and I. And most of the things that Hagee said about 2014 and 2015 were, to me, they seemed to me a stretch. So the ones in 2032 and 2033, well, that's tantalizing. The Lord didn't return in 2015, so will he come in 2033? I don't know. Another allure of the recent blood moon tetrad thing is the desire to fit things into millennia. Bullinger and Asher tried to shoehorn their chronological timelines into millennia. They had Jesus born in 4 BC and Genesis 3 in 4004 BC. But when I did my timeline, I got 4064 BC. And John Shainheit and I went over it with me, and we concurred. That was in 1982. I don't know if he's changed his opinion since. So I'm not sold on the idea that the ideal for Christ, a time for Christ's return would be 2,000 years after his crucifixion. Now, of course, people will quote 2 Peter chapter 3. Let's take a look at that. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. But, beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. This is a simile in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. It's as 1,000 years. That's an approximation. It doesn't say it was equal to 1,000 years. And of course, we don't want to be one verse Charlies. Look at Psalm 90. Psalm 90, verse 4. For 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday, when it is past, and as a watch in the night. Well, okay, there's 3 watches in the night during the Kingdom of Israel times, and 4 watches during the night in Roman times. So if 1,000 years was equal to a watch in the night, then that's either 3 or 4 hours. So instead of 1,000 years being equal to a day, if it's equal to watches, that would either be 6,000 years or 8,000 years being equal to a day. All right? But there's no problem with that if one understands these are similes. They're not saying it's equal. Do you understand? So as tantalizing as even 1,000-year spans sound, I don't think we have to be held to it. But again, we don't know. Now, these discrepancies that the authors of the Blood Moon teaching minimized or overlooked actually represent the crux of the problem. Where are the dread things that they're supposed to portend? So at 2017, at the mini summit, I didn't think that we should get too caught up in that stuff. I advised that we ought to tone down any allusions to the dire events and fear motivation, and then speak of them as interesting. All right? And so, at our summit, Renee and Diane and I agreed to keep working on this stuff. Now, we heard what Diane has developed since, and I think it's wonderful. And then Renee also has published several blogs on his trigod.com website in 2018. And I think those are excellent too, because we don't set dates and we don't fear motivate, all right? But before I get to that, let me complete what we were talking about in 2017. Also in 2017, there was a connection made between a 7-year period in the book of Revelation that was implied from Daniel 9 and 2 solar eclipses in the United States. One's in 2017 and one is within 2024. And someone made the point that they made a crisscross, they made an X right over the USA, the paths of totality, and they're 7 years apart. So they applied that to the dire things happening in the book of Revelation in a 7-year period. Well, I drove down into Kentucky and I saw the eclipse in 2017. We were at a park in Madisonville, Kentucky, and when everything went dark, the lawn sprinklers turned on because they were controlled by photoelectric cells. Well, that was about the only dire thing I heard of. And on April 8th in 2024, there will be another total eclipse which will be visible in the United States. In fact, the zone of total shadow will pass right over my house in Indiana. Well, do I need to get a tinfoil hat? We're going to have a tinfoil hat party and make sure The devil says curses foiled again. But actually, 2 total solar eclipses in the United States, 6.5 years apart. There weren't 7 years by any stretch of Jewish lunar month counting or intercalary months. There were 2 solar eclipses that made an X across a continent. But that's not the first time such a thing's happened. In fact, 70% of the Earth is covered by water, so eclipses usually span oceans. But if such an event were that significant, then we'd expect the past occurrences to have portended terrible things as well. So I went to work again, looked at the NASA website. According to the solar eclipse website, since 1 AD, there have been an average of 63 total solar eclipses per century. And they make an X within a 7-year span over land masses about once every 10 to 15 years. I mean, you can check it for yourself. There's a website, https://eclipse.gsfc.nasa.gov/seatlas/seatlas.html. And in the 20th century, in June of 2009 and August of 2004, there was an X over North Greenland, 2 solar eclipses making an X over continent. In January of 1926 and February of 1934, it did it in Indonesia. In February of 1952 and June of 1954, it did so in Iran, made an X. In 1941 in September and 1945 in July, it did it in Kazakhstan. In 1948 in November and 1952 in February, it did it over the Congo. And in 1972 in July and February 1979, northern Quebec. So, I mean, and there were some in the Caucasus region of Russia and in Kenya and Kamchatka where they made an X. Well, were any of those followed by dire events? No, I don't think so. So I'm just not in favor of trying to scare people. In the next century, the next X marks the spot crossing of 2 solar eclipses within 7 years of each other will be in Egypt in 2027 and 2034, and again in Egypt in 2053 and 2060, in Okinawa in 2063 and 2070. So, the total eclipse X over the United States may seem unique and tempting to portend some event, but after checking the facts, about once a decade event is not statistically significant or alluring. Now, I'm sorry, I'm part scientist, and so I look at the facts. Those who don't know this stuff might be easily swayed by the earnest warnings of people who are pushing this. But in my opinion, as significant and wondrous as these celestial arrangements seem to be, the results have demonstrated that there's a line which we must not cross. Others may cross that line and issue warnings, make dire predictions, but we must not give in to the temptation to follow the lead. You know, with all our fine biblical knowledge and ethics, we should be leading. You know, we have a treasure of understanding that they may not have. So are we following them? Why shouldn't we be leading? All right. So there have been critics of this. Stephen Spicer is one of them. He said that there are 2 kinds of people. There are date setters and date teasers. Date setters set specific dates, which are in fact a countdown clock to the extinction of their own ministries. And he names people: William Miller, Charles Russell, Ronald Wineland, Harold Camping, that all predicted stuff that didn't happen. Then there's date teasers, he says, that share the same rhetoric of urgency, that the end is quote unquote very soon, but they don't lock in a specific date. All right? Well, we don't have to be his two choices. There's a third type. What's our message? I believe that we should use the celestial signs, like many preachers use current events, as springboards in their sermons to bring people to God's Word and glorify God. And that's exactly what Rene does on his website, to get people to think about God, but not to scare them into repentance, but draw them there. See, the story of redemption is told in the stars, so we should bring them to that and then to the written Word. Another critic of the blood moon teaching, Mike Moore, said that the bottom line of John Hagee's book, The Four Blood Moons, is that Jesus is coming, and with that much we can agree. But is it necessary to sensationalize fairly common events, such as lunar eclipses, in order to press home that truth? He had an article that appeared in the magazine of his denomination that Reverend Moore served in as a pastor, and the writer bemoaned a waning interest within that denomination in the second advent, in the Jesus coming again. In the next issue, the reader suggested that the lack of interest in the end times was a reaction to repeated dogmatic statements from the pulpits that every crisis in the world indicated that the Lord was returning and it was just around the corner. Well, humankind cannot bear too much unreality, and instead of a state of perpetual excitement, a state of apathy had set in. So I don't think we should be part of that. We should use our talent and knowledge of celestial events for a different purpose. So that was what my position was in 2017. And I think I was a little hard on Diane and Rene because I was hard-headed. Astronomical events were interesting, but I was still looking for the smoking gun. And at that time, we were missing something. Well, that was until last week when I had a purple smoke moment when I was reading Acts chapter 2. So here we go. Let's look at Acts chapter 2, verse 17. Acts chapter 2, verse 17. Shall come to pass in the last days, saith God, I will pour out of my Spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. And upon my servants and upon my handmaidens will I pour out in those last days of my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. So the pouring out of the Spirit has occurred, and it is the last days. It's the church administration. Verse 19, and I will show wonders in heaven above and signs in earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. And the sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon shall into blood, before that great and notable day of the Lord come. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Now, we all considered this passage in 2017, but we didn't realize there was a clue staring us straight in the face in verse 19 and 20. At that time, my cup was full, and I had no room for anything more. I had to distill things a bit and make room. But when I revisited the scripture in prep for this teaching, it hit me in the nose. Back then, we did not realize the significance of the figures of speech that are there in Joel and Acts. They imply a profound truth in purple smoke. And a solar eclipse occurs when the moon is between the sun and the earth, always at a new moon. A lunar eclipse occurs when the moon is at the opposite side of the earth. So the earth comes between the sun and the moon. So there are two extremes portrayed here. Well, that's like the figure of speech alpha and omega, A to Z, soup to nuts. So verse 20 is the juxtaposition of two extremes, two eclipse wordings, which involve the moon at opposite sides. This juxtaposition of two extremes is called a merism. M-E-R-I-S-M. And in English rhetoric, a merism is the combination of two contrasting words to refer to an entirety. For example, when we say that someone searched thoroughly, they searched everywhere, we often say, we searched high and low. There it is. Or we say, ladies and gentlemen. A famous merism in the Bible is Alpha and Omega. Merisms also figure in a number of familiar English expressions, like the phrase lock, stock, and barrel, originally referred to the parts of a gun, and by counting off several of its parts, it came to refer to the whole thing, the whole of anything that has constituent parts. All right? Everything in between. That's a merism. The Greek name for this figure is merismos. M-E-R-I-S-M-O-S. The Latin is merismus. So, ancient people knew about this. Now, Bullinger's explanation of merismus on page 435 is slightly different than the English rhetoric version. The English rhetoric version says it's just the two extremes, implying everything else in between. But Bullinger says that a merismos is the two extremes, but also followed by a listing of parts. Well, that's exactly what the prophecy of Joel contains. In fact, there are two merisms in a row in Acts chapter 2, verse 19 and 20, and in Joel 2. The first merism states the two extremes: wonders in heaven above and signs in the earth beneath. There's heaven above, earth beneath. There's the extremes, right? Then the constituent parts are blood and fire and vapor of smoke, sun turned to darkness, moon into blood. All right? So that fits Bullinger's classic definition of a formal merismos on page 435. But then the sun being turned into darkness and the moon turned into blood is another set of extremes. So we have a merismus within a merismus. All right? Wow. That's a real deft play on words. So this is really deep, because it implies if you have the extremes, you have the two opposite kinds of eclipses, solar eclipse and lunar eclipse. And those are the most prominent celestial events. Well, those extremes now, because it is a merismus, they imply all the rest of the possible celestial events as well. All right? So these will be involved in announcing the Messiah's coming. I'm going to explain this. In fact, this has already happened once with Jesus' first coming. At the Hope Mini Summit in 2017, I had some reservations and suggestions because some of the blood moon proponents were trying to connect the 2014 and 15 blood moons to the tribulation and all that stuff. I just didn't think that there was that connection, as unique as those celestial events might be. Yet we concluded that the recent celestial events certainly could be part of what we then called a second celestial prelude. See, Rene Fretz taught me about the first celestial prelude. There were a number of celestial events which announced Christ's first coming. And they were more than just the conjunctions of planets that many of us are familiar with that constituted the Star of Bethlehem. A conjunction of planets actually alone was not enough to get the wise men to move, because conjunctions happen too often. All right? In fact, it wasn't enough to get their king to let them go, especially because of the sensitive political situation between the Parthian Empire and the Roman Empire back in 4 and 3 BC. The Romans, in fact, I think they had the king of Parthia's son as a hostage, I believe, at that time. But so it was very, very sensitive. So whenever the wise men went to the king and he said, "You want to do what?" It had to be pretty convincing. So it had to be more than just a conjunction. But what if there was an unusual sequence of events? Because the events by themselves were not uncommon enough, but what about together? Well, Rene posted the following on his trigod.com blog regarding what he called the celestial prelude. I'll just read this to you. It's beautiful. He says, "For nearly 2 decades," Rene says, "I've advocated the concept of a celestial prelude that allowed the Magi to recognize the celestial signs marking the birth of Christ in the well-known historical event called the Star of Bethlehem. There were a number of critical triple planetary conjunctions and blood moons around the king star Jupiter that the Magi recognized as the star of Jesus, King of the Jews. The Magi noticed the triple union of Jupiter and Saturn in 7 BC, 4 years prior to the triple conjunction of Jupiter Regulus in 3 BC. That Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is something that Kepler first proposed. And then Jupiter Regulus in 3 BC, marking the birth of Christ. There also was a triple conjunction of Jupiter and Venus that framed the birth of Christ from 3 to 1 BC, which was documented and possibly seen again in a different form in the conversions of the supermoon triads, which were in 2014 and 15, blood moon tetrad, leading to the 923 Revelation 12 sign, with the rise of the blood moon tetrads, most notably the modern tetrads from 1950, 1967, and 2014-15. So he's referring to those tetrads that I listed. We find an increasing emphasis on the series of supermoons leading to a 2022 supermoon tetrad. This seems to begin with a single supermoon on January 26, 1948, ahead of the 1949-50 blood moon tetrad, marking the formation of the State of Israel. He says, the premise of a celestial prelude is based on the simple fact that God would not ordain the long-awaited birth of his only begotten Son, the eternal purpose of the ages, without little advance notice. The concept of this prelude is based on the Jupiter-Saturn triple conjunctions of 7 and 6 BC. This was not as close of a union as these planets as the one next week, he's saying in his blog. The triple union of 7 and 6 BC provided a basis for the Magi to recognize the triple conjunction of Jupiter Regulus in 3 and 2 BC and as the specific signs marking the birth of Christ. This prelude has 2 parts. First, the general, and second, the specific. Confusion of these 2 separate parts of the celestial prelude has caused much uncertainty surrounding the Star of Bethlehem. A good place to start thinking about the first part of this prelude is, where did the popular idea of a single bright star, obvious to all, marking Christ's birth originate? The answer is found in what I referred to above as the general sign of the celestial prelude that had alerted the Magi to the broader period when the promised seed would appear. The first decan or subordinate sign of Virgo was originally called Coma. All right, and next to Virgo. So there is another, Virgo is the woman. Then there is another woman holding up a child called Coma. This is what he's referring to. And the general sign was a supernova that occurred in the head of the child in coma. And this supernova was visible for over 275 years, beginning in 128 BC. This was the general sign, the star out of Jacob, that prepared the Magi to watch for the specific aspects of the second part of the celestial prelude, which include the Jupiter-Saturn triple unions of 7 and 6 BC in Pisces. And we find the second aspect of Balaam's prophecy referring to the scepter, symbolic of the reign of the king planet Jupiter. As we progress through our study, it becomes evident that Jupiter was that planet that the Magi called his star. In Matthew 2:2, the Magi noted the triple conjunction of signs from 7 and 6 BC of Jupiter and Saturn that gave him a blueprint for the actual signs marking Christ's birth starting in 3 BC. All right? So, the general sign was the nova, and the specific sign was the conjunctions. Now, we know that Revelation chapter 12, verse 1 and 2 actually gives us the date of the birth of Christ as Rosh Hashanah 3 BC, when the sun was in Virgo and the moon was between her feet. That occurred September 11th, 3 BC, between 6:18 and 7:38 p.m. That's when Jesus was born. Then Revelation chapter 12, verse 3 and 4 is the second sign that occurred that same night. There was a meteor shower that arose out of the constellation of Draco, and the radiant was the seventh brightest star, Eta Draconis, which is in the tail of Draco, and that is 1/3 of the stars of heaven being cast to the ground with his tail, as in Revelation chapter 12, verse 3 and 4. So all of those signs together made up the celestial prelude. And that's what convinced the wise men to travel to Judea. It wasn't the nova itself, nor the eclipses, nor the conjunctions alone, as spectacular as they were. In fact, the Jupiter-Venus conjunctions in 3 and 2 BC came so close, they formed one star, and that's very rare. All right? The retrograde motion, triple conjunction with Jupiter Regulus in 3 BC and 2 BC, was so rare it had not happened in hundreds of years, and the last time it happened, a king was born during it. Okay? The Revelation 12, 1 and 2 sign happens every year, once a year during the fall. The meteor shower in Revelation chapter 12, verse 3 and 4 does happen every year between September 9th and 12th. But that meteor shower is so old now, one can only discern it with a radio telescope, because the debris from the comet that caused it is very, very minor right now. The dust of meteors long gone. Each by itself was not enough, but together they were the prelude. So, now, are the tetrads unique enough to be on the same level as the bold signs of Christ's birth? Well, no. But the merism in Joel and in Matthew 24 and Acts 2 says, yes, quite possibly, if combined with the rest of possible celestial phenomena. All right? What are the other phenomena? Well, you have eclipses, you have conjunctions, you have meteor showers, you have novas, you have asteroids. Okay? Let's compare the two passages. All right? Revelation chapter 12, verse 1 and 4. Here we go. Revelation chapter 12, verse 1. And there appeared a great wonder, Simeon is the word, in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth and pain to be delivered. Okay, Virgo is the woman. clothed with the sun is when the sun is in Virgo. Upon her head a crown of 12 stars. There are 12 stars above Virgo's head that can be seen with the naked eye. And they are part of Virgo. They're not part of Leo. They're not planets. They're actually 12 stars that are there. All right? And so the moon is between her feet. That happens once every year in September, depending upon the orbits of the moon. All right? Chapter 12, verse 3. There appeared another wonder, Simeon, same word, in heaven. And behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And the tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. So, when I learned about Revelation 12, 1 and 2 in 1980 in the book Jesus Christ, Our Promised Seed, I always looked at verse 3 and 4 and said, well, if 1 and 2 was Virgo, couldn't verse 3 and 4 be another constellation just like Virgo? And to me, the constellation candidate was Draco, the dragon. And so every time I ran into anyone that had astronomy background, I'd always ask him that. And in 2002, I ran into a gentleman named Reese Watkins from Atlanta, I believe. And I asked him the same question. He said, I'll get back to you. I think a week or two later, he got back to me and he said, there was a meteor shower that night. Woo! Because you can trace back the path of the meteors, and they were from a comet, just like all the other meteor showers. And they followed the same path around the Earth as the Earth passes through the path of the comet. Then it passes through the debris field from the comet. And there are meteor showers periodically every year, same time of the year. So there was a meteor shower called the Minor Eta Draconid meteor shower. And you can look this up on the internet. I have the information concerning it in my Kindle book, Happy Belated Birthday, Jesus, with the website that you can go and look at and get all the statistical information. This meteor shower, the night that it happened between September 9th and 12th every year. So in 3 BC, September 11th, right smack dab. I believe that night the meteor shower was fresh and it looked as if the sky was falling, like the 1833 and 1866 Leonid meteor showers, that there were so many meteors, people thought the world was ending. You could actually hear them hissing in the atmosphere. The next year, a whole bunch of churches were started. But, so that's Draco. So, those was a sign, Simeon, in heaven, that were constellations. All right? So, here you have Matthew 24, verse 29. Matthew 24, verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation in those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. The sign of the Son of Man in heaven is the same word as Revelation 12:1 and Revelation 12:3. Wonder in heaven, Simeon. So, could that be something having to do with a constellation? Okay. Just like in Revelation chapter 12? Well, what do Renee and I think? The blood moons alone are not enough of a unique event to get us worried, all right? But Jesus is still coming back, all right? Just don't get crazy about it and do something stupid, because we should live like he's coming back soon. Hint, hint, right? Live looking up. But also, we should make plans like he's not coming back for 100 years. Why? Because we don't know. He said it'll happen like a thief in the night, right? The word and the celestial announcements are reminders that it could be any time. Are there more of them coming soon than usual, celestial events? I don't know, but I'd like to think so. I told Renee about the merism this week and the celestial prelude, and he wrote me back and said, quote, "We just had an example of this eclipse phenomena on May 26th, with the blood moon lunar eclipse followed by the annular solar eclipse earlier this month on June 10th, with about 2 weeks separating those two events." Remember how I said the minimum amount of time between a solar and a lunar eclipse is 15 days? Well, we just had one, okay? This is a pattern in how these eclipses occur. Also, in my recent May 2021 blog, Renee says, on the Star of David, I cover examples of the heaven above and earth below in Genesis, giving other biblical examples of this, which include brackets in some of the scripture refs. Those are those repetitions. So, are there enough candidates right now that we can wind up our planetariums and run our celestial computer programs enough to anticipate which ones they will be? Well, were predictable planetary conjunctions or eclipses enough for the celestial prelude? I don't think so by themselves. But remember, the celestial prelude included something not predictable, a nova. Well, can those be predicted? For example, astronomers say that the red giant star, Betelgeuse, could explode tomorrow or any time in the next 100,000 years. And it has been displaying unusual activity lately. Guess what constellation, Simeon, that Betelgeuse is in? Orion. Orion depicts the Redeemer, the Messiah. If Betelgeuse goes supernova, I might get nervous. It is about 643 light years away, and it may have already gone nova, but the light has not reached us yet. Bullinger, in his Witnesses of the Stars book, writes this about Orion. Quote, "He is so pictured in the ancient Dendera zodiac, where we see a man coming forth, pointing to the three bright stars, Rigel, Bellatrix, and Betelgeuse, as his. His name is given as Ha-ge-at, which means this is he who triumphs. The hieroglyphic characters below read O-A-R. Orion was anciently spelled O-A-R-I-O-N, from the Hebrew root which means light. So Orion means coming forth as light. The ancient Akkadian was Orana, the light of heaven. Orion is the most brilliant of all constellations, and when he comes to the meridian, he is accomplished by several adjacent constellations of great splendor. There is then above the horizon the most glorious view of the celestial bodies that the starry firmament affords, and this magnificent view is visible to all the habitable world because the equinoctial line or solstical cold year, I guess those are astronomical terms, passes nearly through the middle of Orion. The brightest Alpha star in the right shoulder is named Betelgeuse, which means the coming of the branch. The next in the left foot is Rigel, which means the foot that crushes. The foot is lifted up and placed immediately over the head of the enemy as though in the very act of crushing it. Thus the name of the star bespeaks the act. The next star in the left shoulder is called Bellatrix, which means quickly coming or swiftly destroying. The coming of the branch, Betelgeuse in the constellation Orion, coming forth as light. Will that be the sign of the Son of Man in the heavens mentioned in Matthew 24? The word sign there is the same word, Simeon, as was in Revelation 12, which we know were constellations. So Virgo, Draco, and next, possibly, Orion. Wow. But even then, does any man know when he's coming back? No. But we can speak in tongues and work the other manifestations, and that's proof he's coming, for sure. So we ought to live looking up with that twinkle in our eye that makes everything honorable worth it. There may be other unpredictable celestial phenomena which could converge at that time. Meteors, asteroids, comets, because of the merismos, the extremes that were put for all the other possibilities. I believe that just like there was a celestial prelude to Christ's first coming, that there will be something similar to his second, a celestial encore. He is coming back on the stage for another performance, and that will last forever, glory hallelujah. So now, just like at that campfire long ago, we all are looking up, straining our eyes to see Betelgeuse in Orion, but for a different reason. Will that be the sign of his coming? Stay tuned and stay living looking up. Bless you. That's it.